The last panther entering the Kessel. In the spring of 1945, the war that we had provoked with such ambition was closing in on us like a trap. In January of that year, I drove a Tiger I Panzer in our defense of the Oder River. In February, my battalion was shattered and my commander, Hellman, died burning in his turret. In April, in the middle of the intense reorganization that our collapse demanded, I was named commander of my own tank in the 21st Panzer Division, part of the great German Ninth Army. My tank was one of the magnificent Panthers, the pride of the armored forces. My rank was now Feldwebel, sergeant, and I commanded a crew of teenagers who admired me as if I were a veteran at 20 years old. Our units tried to slow the Red Army's advance toward Berlin. It was impossible, and we dispersed, while the Reds advanced toward the capital. In the last week of April, the trap closed. The Red forces surrounded our entire Ninth Army, south of Berlin, and locked us in a wooded zone where we could only hide our vehicles and await orders. The hiding place was a torment. We were sitting in our panzers, sweating, inside the Russian siege, inside a pine forest, inside a 48-ton Panther. It was then that I realized how completely trapped I was, crouched in the commander's seat in the turret, with sweat running down my back and my heart beating like a pneumatic hammer. The shadows of the Russian bombers were projected between the branches of the pines, and the sound of the Russian artillery was deafening even through the armor of the Panther. We were trapped by the Russians, who without a doubt would send us to Siberia if they captured us. Our only hope was to reach the American lines on the Elbe River to the west, since the Americans were now our great hope. At another time, they had been our enemies, the destroyers of our cities, but now they were our salvation if we managed to reach them. Being a prisoner of the Amos meant hot dogs, cabbage, and the Geneva Convention. Being a prisoner of the Reds, we were sure, meant slavery, the Arctic Polar Circle, and never seeing our homeland again. But there was a whole Russian army between our combat group and the Americans, between our handful of Panthers, our exhausted Panzer Grenadiers, and a group of civilian refugees that followed us, sobbing like a funeral cortege. "How much time do we have to wait?" Herr Feldwebel, my gunner asked. "The capo will return soon," I answered. "The capo will know what to do." Capo was the name that we had given to the leader of our platoon, our lieutenant. His original unit of 6 Panthers had been reduced to 3 surviving vehicles, and he was attending an emergency meeting of officers to decide our group's next movement. The air in the Panther's turret was unbreathable. Exhaust monoxide, projectile explosives, oil, and 5 big, hunched young men who had not washed in weeks and sweated from the heat. I opened my commander's dome. Light flooded the hatch, a clear spring light with the aroma of pine needles. Through a gap between the trees, I could see white clouds high in the blue sky. However, in a second, the sky was crossed with vapor trails and the wings with red stars of the Russian planes, and the stench of explosives arrived with the warm breeze. In that moment, I realized the absolute hopelessness of our situation. Our 3 Panthers were parked between the pine trunks in a very dense wooded zone. To the east, we had a thin line of troops as rear guard, but the Russians were probing and testing that line minute by minute. The sound of their tank engines rose and fell with the breeze, and we could hear the exchanges of fire between our boys and the Russian infantry that rode on the Red Panthers. We knew from experience that the Russian commanders did not like to enter the forests, whether for tactical reasons or for some Slavic superstition, and their enormous Joseph Stalin Panzers, machines as big as the Tiger I Panzers, could not maneuver nor cross the canyons between the trees unless they knew the roads that we knew. To the northwest and to the southeast, 2 groups of the Russian army had closed on our position in a pincer of armored vehicles and mechanized infantry, crushing the few villages that remained outside the forest. Haydn had been bombed and reduced to ashes, and its inhabitants had died in the basements. In Munchhof, the few civilian women that remained had been raped for hours in the town square. Our reconnaissance men had observed all this from the forest, their hearts torn between shooting the rapists or keeping their position hidden. Schleppzig, a town of dairies and watermills, was reduced to rubble by the fire of Katyusha incendiary rockets, and the ditch where the last families took refuge became their tomb. Now, A solid ring of Russian forces surrounded us. Here, in the forest, where we hid like wounded animals, our 3 Panther Panzers and several King Tiger Panzers of the Panzer Corps of the Waffen-SS were isolated with a group of about 5,000 men. Volksgrenadiers of the Wehrmacht, elite troops of the Waffen-SS, a company of Fallschirmjäger, paratroopers, and a great number of the inevitable stragglers. More men of the Wehrmacht, panzer troops that had lost their vehicles, orderlies of the rear guard, mechanics of the Luftwaffe, gunners without weapons, and a dozen of other types and classes. Among them, huddled and grouped between the trees, were groups of civilians. They were women, children, and old men who had fled their homes in the farms and villages before the advance of the Reds. With all their possessions reduced to a handful of bundles or piles of things in wheelbarrows, they sat in the shadows, looking at the sky above the treetops, or walking from one side to another like caged animals in the space that remained between the trees and the soldiers. Among them, I saw our capo returning from his informative meeting, with his mottled camouflage uniform that adapted well to the mottled light, his face fixed in his permanent frown of concentration, and the iron cross that he wore with pride on his neck. He passed next to the groups of civilians without looking. Only when an airplane passed very low over the treetops, low enough for the pine cones to fall among us like toy grenades, only then did he look at the sky. We all looked up. From the tops of the pines came small pieces of paper that floated and twisted in the air. Most were trapped between branches, but some slipped through and fell slowly to the forest floor. I grabbed one fluttering by the turret and looked at it. It was a leaflet printed in German, in clear font. Reich forces. You are surrounded by our armies, and the war's end is imminent. Do not waste any more lives. Any soldier who carries this leaflet to the Russian lines will be treated well, and all civilians will receive food and shelter. We all know the war is about to end. Why keep fighting senselessly? Save yourselves. After dark, your safety will not be guaranteed. The capo snatched the leaflet from my hand, read it quickly, hunched over the Panther's engine, and then burst out laughing. Ah, so they will treat us well. He laughed, patting my back. What do you think, Faust? Do we take a chance? I feigned indecision, stroking my chin. It seems a very generous offer, sir. I have heard the hotels in Siberia are very spacious. He laughed ironically, gesturing to the crewmen of the other tanks to come closer and join us. And there's as much snow as you can eat each day. I don't know, Lieutenant, I said. Russian snow does not suit me. Me neither, Faust. The capo winked and put the leaflet in his pocket. I will use this paper later, by myself, over a hole. However, some civilians had taken leaflets and were studying them, debating the proposal in urgent voices. The capo turned his back and gathered the 3 crewmen of our Panther, 15 men in total, at the rear of the vehicle, where the large exhaust pipes were at head height. All right, said the capo, watching his men. We are trapped here like rats in a sack. The men nodded, knowing it was true. And there's one thing in that damn leaflet that's true, continued the capo. The war is coming to an end. We have to accept that fact, if we have not already. After the war, Germany will continue to exist, and Germany will need men like us to rebuild it, to make it strong again and care for the people. Germany will need us as much in the coming years as it has in the last 6, I can tell you. But for us to serve Germany in the future, we must surrender to the Americans. That is our task now. The Panzer crewmen looked at each other. The war's end? Germany occupied and then rebuilt? They were grandiose and difficult ideas, but the capo kept us focused on more immediate concerns. In this part of the forest, we are just one of many surrounded groups of the Ninth Army. All these groups must move west and gather in Spree Forest. We will do it at dawn. From the Spree, we will gather our armored forces and break west in a coordinated movement, led by our heaviest available armor. At the same time, the 12th Army will fight to break through from the Elbe River to our meeting and form a corridor through which our forces can advance west and the Americans. The crews reacted instinctively, launching tactical questions at the capo. Who would lead the final breakthrough from Spree Forest? The King Tiger Panzers of the SS Panzer Corps. They will be the mallet to open a path through the red lines. It would be the rear guard after we left the Spree Forest. The remains of the 32nd Panzer Division. They would keep the Reds at bay from the east while the escape route opened. Ammunition supplies? There were none available. Each Panther had 30 shells, half of its standard amount. Fuel? There was no fuel available. Fuel would have to be found in abandoned vehicles or supplies on the route west. The men nodded gravely. We all noticed that the capo, normally so precise, had shown no map or diagram of the planned route or enemy positions. That meant he had no map. Well, so be it. Lieutenant, what will happen to the civilians? The capo hesitated for a moment, something unusual for him. The civilians, if they can follow, let them, he said softly. If not, they will have to stay. All of them? Yes, all of them. They will have to continue fighting alone. We cannot evacuate or help them. If we stay, both civilians and troops are lost. If we manage to escape, at least some troops will be saved for the future of our country. But, her lieutenant, the women, said a Panther commander, to leave them at the mercy of the Reds, to be raped and killed. The capo took a deep breath and fixed his gaze on the armored plate of the Panther that he had next to him. We cannot help them, he repeated. It is a national tragedy. We're trying to salvage something good from this disaster, from the events that occurred. It is our duty now. But, her lieutenant, it is our duty. We will set off at dawn. In the spring twilight, the sound of fighting from the east was clearly audible. It was also evident to the civilians camped among us, young mothers with children who sat pale and hunched around makeshift stoves, while their children rummaged through the pine needles and earth. It was evident to the old men who remained standing looking at the stoves, sucking on pieces of hard bread from their backpacks. These civilians did not ask questions, since by the way we prepared the panzers, checking the engines and distributing ammunition among the crews, they knew we were leaving. Until now, we had advanced slowly when possible, allowing civilians to follow us with their carts and bundles. Now we would charge, launching ourselves in a wild race towards the Spree Forest with the other battered remains of the Ninth Army, with no time to wait for the noncombatants. To reconnoiter the route ahead for this dawn getaway, I advanced on foot with the capo. We left the camp and walked, with our MP-40s in our hands, along a series of paths between the trees, remembering the route of our previous reconnaissance raids. The pine trees became scarcer, and we spotted the edge of the forest where trees gave way to a sandy plain, dotted at intervals by craters, lakes, and swampy areas. That was the way to the Spree Forest and west. It was an unpromising terrain to advance through, open and soft, full of obstacles that could jam a panzer or leave it stranded at the mercy of enemy fire. The plain was dotted with wrecked vehicles, trucks, cars, and Hanomag half-tracks that had tried to cross it 2 days before, when the Russian pincers were closing on our hideouts in the forest. The capo and I advanced on foot beyond where we had reached, skirting the trees, where abandoned equipment, weapons, and supplies betrayed the place where the last troops had tried to flee before the trap closed. There were also many corpses along the way. Many were Wehrmacht soldiers, hit by projectile fire or incendiary bombs that left the trees in flames. The smell of ash, pine sap, and decaying bodies floated in the air, untouched by the warm breeze. There were also corpses of civilians who had tried to run behind the troops. A group of women pushed a wheelbarrow, their shattered bodies among the pine cones, faces towards the branches. The quilts and bowls from their wheelbarrow lay scattered around them. After that, "My God," the capo said. "What happened here?" A small battle had been fought at the forest's edge, where a rough road led to the plain. A section of German infantry lay dead in the charred remains of their truck. Behind them, another group of women lay dead, but these women had been stripped naked, and their naked bodies testified to the rape they had suffered in their last moments. Each had a bullet hole in their forehead, 5 corpses in total, 5 shots to the forehead. "This is what awaits our civilians," the capo murmured. "And yet, we cannot take them with us." We crouched in the shadows when a pair of Soviet fighters flew over the trees. The planes strafed the open plain for no reason, their cannons shattering abandoned vehicles, some bursting into flames. Then we heard the echo of their departure and the constant noise of fighting beyond the forest. The capo turned from the women's corpses and pointed to the other side of the plain. "The SS King Tigers will go first," he said. "They will move at high speed, near the forest where the ground is firmer. We will follow them and keep any Reds at bay on the flanks of the plain. The infantry will move behind us along the edges of the forest. Then we will charge downhill towards the town of Markhof and cross it. The bulk of the Ninth Army is gathering 5 kilometers further on in the Spree forest beyond the plain. When we meet them, the fight will really begin." I nodded, looking at the road that bordered the trees. We would move like ducks in a fairground shooting gallery, one after another. Even at that moment, there were surely Russian eyes in Markhof on the other side of the plain or hidden among the trees of the forest on both sides, watching our men for signs of a leak. The Russians had unlimited ammunition, infinite supplies of panzers and troops in quantities they considered expendable. All that against our few King Tigers and 3 Panthers and a motley army of hungry, disoriented infantry, desperate to reach the Americans. So desperate that they would abandon their own civilians to the Reds. There was no other way. Twilight was approaching, and, as we returned to camp, the horizon beyond the plain was lit by tall columns of flames rising under the stars. We assumed they were the remains of one of our transport columns trapped on the other side of the open ground. How many trucks, panzers, and wagons would have to burn to create such a column of fire? Closer, the sky was lit by flares with which the Russians tried to illuminate the forest. A parachute flare fell on us. Its white magnesium ignited the branches of the pine trees and lit up the entire area as if it were daytime, until we hurried away from its glow and returned to our hiding place deep in the trees. Although no lights or fires could be seen, the entire forest seemed awake at dusk and working like hell. We passed through dark areas where we knew the Waffen SS King Tiger panzers were hidden under piles of branches, and we heard the noise of branches being moved and the roar of the powerful engines starting. In other areas, our infantry was preparing for dawn. No one was sleeping. How could they, knowing what the morning would bring? Among them, the cries of the civilian children and their mothers reminded us of the imminent fate of these compatriots as soon as the Reds entered the forest. I pushed that thought out of my mind and returned to my Panther. My crew was good. Taking advantage of the last lights of the day, they cleaned the long barrel of the Panther with 6-meter-long rods with which they inserted a rag and pulled it out until it was clean. This is how they cleaned the bore of the barrel of explosive residue, ensuring that the weapon would fire accurately and without deforming. We also checked the tracks, the lubrication points inside the turret, the hydraulic system, and the engine's oil filters. Then we sat inside the Panther, me, my gunner, and our loader in our positions in the turret, the radio operator in his machine gun position in the hull, and the driver next to him at the controls. Were we sleeping? Or were we awake and thinking about the battle that awaited us in the morning? I was doing both, alternating between sleep and reflection, while the flashes and explosions illuminated the glass of the periscopes of my dome. At the first ray of light, the civilians stood up to watch us leave. They were gray, spectral figures, wrapped in shawls and blankets, with the children clinging to the women's knees. Some began to gather behind us when we started the engines. The Panther's exhaust threw sparks into the air, illuminating the civilians with red and orange flashes. I saw them for the last time from the dome, a phalanx of figures, stumbling and running after us while the Panthers swayed between the trees towards the plain. Then the infantry came to follow us. In a few seconds, huge groups of our soldiers emerged from between the shadows and hollows of the trees behind us, swarming in the dust and smoke that we were throwing out, knocking down the few women who could still follow us, and finally hiding the last civilians behind a solid wall of ragged, gray, and blue uniforms. In the light of dawn, they were unshaven, emaciated, with eyes full of empty determination. The civilians, abandoned to their fate, were now alone there. The race to the Spree forest was beginning now. The turret of my Panther was damp, full of smoke and the roar of the Maybach engine through the wall. We advanced at a walking pace between the trees, following an old forest track bordered by the remains of abandoned vehicles, felled trees, and wounded men unable to walk who were desperately seeking help. At every moment, more and more soldiers of our infantry emerged from the depths of the forest, ready to join the escape route to the west. As we approached the edge of the forest, near where I had patrolled with the capo at sunset, we came across a phenomenal sight. Two of our huge King Tiger panzers were already positioned to try to get out of the forest. With almost 1.5 times the weight of my Panther, they towered over the narrow road, spewing exhaust, with their mottled camouflage well adapted to the light and shadow. Their ultra-long 88mm cannons pointed west, away from the density of the trees, with a cannon so long that it ran the risk of hitting the trees when maneuvering the vehicle. The commanders were visible in the domes of the turrets, with their faces expressionless, showing no emotion. Seeing us, they waited barely a few seconds, and then the Tigers shook and headed toward the plain. The air behind them trembled with the heat of their exhaust, and their tracks threw branches and clods of earth as they bit into the ground with their huge steel treads. At the edge of the forest, a platoon of engineers worked with axes to cut down the last remaining trees. The last trees that hid the interior of the forest and prevented vehicles from leaving or entering. One by one, the trees were falling, and when the last one fell, the two Tigers crushed it with their tracks as they advanced over the rubble. Pushing aside the remains of burned trucks, the two Tigers headed towards the plain's edge. Behind them, another King Tiger emerged from the depths between the trees, with its sloping front plate and long, slender turret covered in foliage. He miscalculated the narrow passage between the trees and had to knock down a series of huge pines to reach the perimeter, wasting time and gasoline and risking damage by destroying the trunks. Finally, in a hurricane of smoke, sparks, crashing trees, and roaring engines, the King Tigers came out onto the plain and advanced along the line of trees to the west. The Russians responded at once. While our Panther maneuvered to reach the exit point, passing next to the lines of infantry held back by their officers, I put my forehead against the periscope and squinted to look along the trees. I could see the last of the King Tigers in front of us, throwing sparks in the gray light, with the turret pointing to the left, across the plain, towards the opposite side. In a matter of seconds, a tracer flash hit it on the side of the turret, and a projectile bounced off the sloping side wall and veered towards the trees, still shining. The Tiger shook, but continued to advance, turning its cannon to point at the possible origin. I ordered my gunner, who controlled the turret rotation, to turn our cannon in the same way. Through the visor of my dome, I only saw a solid wall of shadowy trees, with fog between them, giving no sign of enemy activity. Then the tracer reappeared and crossed the plain towards the King Tiger again. I saw the projectile impact the Tiger, this time in the rear, near the tracks and the idler wheel. It was a high-explosive projectile, and it exploded in a white burst. I saw the entire rear wheel of the Tiger, a metal disc that took 3 men to lift, fly off, and fall onto the meadow. The Tiger's track links fragmented and scattered, and the 70-ton Panzer spun out of control to one side, blocking the road with a rain of dirt and stones until it stopped, with the tracks hanging behind, trembling to the rhythm of the tank's engine. Those Red gunners knew how to take down a King Tiger in stages, not with armor-piercing projectiles, but first by blowing up the undercarriage, leaving it immobilized. However, I saw the shot's origin and indicated it to my gunner, who controlled the Panther's turret. Between the trees, where the fog was dissipating over a small lake of reeds, the outline of a T-34 tank could be seen, enveloped in the smoke from its cannon. At my order, our driver slowed and stopped to give us stability to fire. My gunner grunted as the Panther swayed and stood still, then aimed with the hydraulic controls and fired. The tracer shot out, and the Panther shook gently, while our muzzle brake and hydraulic shock absorbers absorbed the recoil of the cannon. We moved again and approached the stranded King Tiger now. Between the trees, I saw that our projectile had hit the T-34 because its front plate was emitting dark smoke and beginning to advance out of the line of trees to shorten the distance. Ahead, the damaged Tiger was firing at the T-34, with the hull rocking as it discharged each shot. He fired again and again, and I realized that the crew was determined to fire all their ammunition before abandoning the vehicle. From the opposite line of trees, I saw through my periscopes more T-34s emerging from the forest, knocking down trees in their path as they advanced heavily to face us. For being panzers that barely matched the Panther in armor and armament, not to mention the King Tiger, they showed no hesitation in launching themselves towards our panzers, circling around the ridges and ponds. The King Tiger in front of us was firing like the devil, launching volley after volley against a row of 6 T-34s that were advancing. The enormous 88mm cannon of the Tiger quickly finished off 2 of the Red Panzers. One of them was hit in the turret, tearing off a large metal plate that shot out through the plane in a shower of sparks. The T-34 turned on itself, out of control, and crashed nose first into a reed bed. I told my gunner not to shoot, to save ammunition, as it was starting to burn. The Tiger hit the second T-34 directly through the glassy plate, and I saw large chunks of the hull fly off as the machine exploded inside. My own gunner hit a third Red tank that was rushing towards us, impacting on the cannon mantlet with such force that it completely tore off the upper surface of the turret. The T-34 continued to advance towards us, with its dead commander hanging from the shattered turret, his body in flames. We did not shoot at him, but let him approach, slowly losing momentum, until it stopped and burst into an orange ball of fire. I looked around through the periscopes to assess the situation. The remaining 3 T-34s were retreating backwards, keeping their thick front plates towards us and firing wildly with their undoubtedly abundant ammunition. The King Tiger was shooting at them, clearly determined to hit them squarely with its remaining bullets. He shot one of the retreating Red tanks through the front track, which unrolled and came off. That T-34 swerved to one side, crashed into a depression, and overturned, with the upper hull exposed and the still functioning track spinning freely. The Tiger fired a last shot and pierced the tank through the engine cover. The entire vehicle shook as the engine exploded, and even as the crewmen struggled to jump out of the hatches, the fuel erupted into a furnace that illuminated the wasteland in a wide radius. I looked away as the flaming crewmen disappeared into the flames, and saw the crew of the King Tiger disembark and gesture to my Panther for help. In the woods next to the King Tiger, our infantry moved among the trees, advancing rapidly behind the King Tigers heading west. Behind us, the Capo's Panther and our 3rd Panther closed the rear guard, just as we had planned, protecting the infantry from further attacks. I allowed the crew of the abandoned King Tiger to climb into our Panther, and, within seconds, they clung to the rear deck among the engine fumes. As we circled their abandoned vehicle, I saw it explode from within, with the hatches flying into the air. The crew, professional to the end, had placed an explosive charge to prevent the Reds from capturing the powerful machine. After that, we continued to advance, keeping the forest with its mass of moving men to our right and the plain to our left. About 600 meters ahead, the King Tigers were leading the way, with their large turrets rising and falling as the hulls plowed through the undulating terrain. We had advanced about 2 kilometers and had 3 more to go to reach the town. The light was increasing, and the pine trees were beginning to show their green hue at dawn. I wiped the sweat from my face. Was it possible that we were going to make it to break through? The Red forces seemed not to react, except for that brief counterattack by the T-34 unit. But I knew the Reds too well to take for granted that they were asleep or distracted. At all times, with every crunch of the Panther's running gear, every roar of the Maybach engine, I expected more trouble. This came in the form of a massive bombardment, a rain of rockets that appeared above the treetops to the west, leaving a trail of sparks, and crashed down on our column in seconds. "Katyushas," I shouted. "Keep going, driver, in God's name." The rockets crashed into the ground along the tree line, bursting between my Panzer and the King Tiger ahead, and showered us with shrapnel that struck our armor with hollow impacts. I looked back through the periscope and saw the Tiger crew on the engine deck, taking shelter behind her turret. A Katyusha exploded behind us, and 2 of the crewmen were thrown from the hull. falling into the path of the capo's panther, following us. I saw the panther swerve, but I couldn't see if it avoided crushing the men. In the trees beside us, the rockets exploded in swirls of destruction, knocking down tall trunks and throwing them into the air. Below them, the masses of infantry ran like possessed men, jumping over the wounded and dying as they struggled to advance, to get out of that fire zone. Then, the rockets went from high explosive to incendiary and exploded among the trees in curtains of liquid flames that cascaded over the fleeing men, covering the unfortunate with a torrent of fire. The men ran in flames, jumped and rolled with their uniforms and rifles burning on their backs. Others jumped over them, crouching among the flames that poured down in their frantic search for a way to escape. Ahead, I saw two king tigers silhouetted against the exploding flames, at a point where the forest wall crumbled and the plains sloped down towards the town of Markov, which we would have to cross. I saw the huge vehicles slow down, kicking up clouds of dust with their tracks, and then stop on the plain, away from the burning trees. Why they stopped there, on the crest of the hill at the top of the slope, where they could be so easily seen? With the Katyushas still bursting around us, we approached the king tigers and then drew level with them, with our panther tipping over the crest of the hill next to them, to look down. I could immediately see why even a king tiger would stop before that slope. The village of Markov was clearly visible, with flames rising from its outlying houses and the slender church spire protruding from the smoke. The slope that separated us from the settlement gradually descended for about 2 kilometers, with the scrub smoking from the morning dew. This slope was absolutely covered in explosions. I was being bombarded with heavy artillery from the red sectors, with projectiles large enough to tear off pieces of earth the size of cars and throw them into the air, disintegrating as they fell. The slope was littered with abandoned and burned vehicles, the remains of our last elements that arrived to the west before the siege. As I watched, an abandoned 8-wheeled armored vehicle was hit by a projectile and thrown into the air as high as a house, with the wheels spinning in all directions. Any vehicle that crossed this death zone was an invitation to destruction. The capo contacted me by radio, and my operator connected me through the headphones. "We have to keep going," he shouted. "We cannot stop. Look, the tigres are moving." Yes, the 2 great king tigers are beginning their charge up the slope, with their angled frontal plates pointing directly towards the town and their long cannons pointing at the houses. "If we manage to take the town and the road that crosses it," shouted the capo, "the infantry will be able to pass. Follow the tigres." "My God," our gunner said suddenly. "My God, Herr Feldwebel, they're wounded down there." As we began to advance up the slope, in the midst of the whirlwind of explosions, with shrapnel hitting our armor, I saw that the gunner was right. On one side of the slope, there was a series of trailers with abandoned rubber wheels, some still hooked to trucks, others simply left outdoors. They were metallic trailers of the type often used as ambulances, and through the open rear doors I could clearly see the wounded arranged in rows inside, some making weak gestures to us. There were 5 trailers of this type, with about 50 or 60 wounded in total. We approached one of them, accelerating and unable to stop or provide assistance to the wounded. Our only hope of passing was to keep moving and minimize our time in the open. As we passed next to the first trailer, it was shaken by a high explosive projectile that tore off the sides and threw the wounded, still on their stretchers, to the ground. There was no possibility of dodging. Our panther passed over them without even bouncing, crushing their shattered bodies where they lay. Our driver moaned and cursed when he saw what had happened, but there was no way to avoid such a massacre. The other trailers we passed were full of terrified faces of wounded men, huddled together as the projectiles exploded around them, knowing that death could come at any moment. Then we left those condemned men behind and sped down the slope, jumping and bouncing between the explosions of the projectiles towards the town. Ahead of us, I saw the 2 king tigers advancing like bulldozers up the slope, crushing the few vehicles that stood in their way. One of the tigers completely crushed an empty staff car, and the gasoline that remained in it exploded in a cloud of flames under the tracks of the tiger. The other tiger sank into a cane field and came out covered in mud and water, with such momentum that not even the swampy terrain could stop it. That tiger was hit by a projectile that exploded on its side, and its armored protections were shot out in an explosion of fire, but the Panzer did not reduce its speed for even a second. As we ran behind the king tigers, I looked around for our other two panthers. The capo, distinguishable by the extended radio antenna of his commander's vehicle, was next to us, but our third panther was lagging behind, advancing more slowly. Perhaps he had a problem with the engine or had received a projectile impact on the running gear. He slowed down even more, falling behind, and I had to refocus my attention on the front. We were approaching the town, and now we could see the Russian PACs, anti-tank cannons placed on earth embankments around the meadows on the outskirts. A PAC projectile hit us on the frontal plate with a crash that made my teeth chatter, and then another crashed against our turret near my head, like a blow to the temple. However, we kept moving, and I saw how repeated PK projectiles bounced off the colossal armor of the Tigris in front of us, and how the tracer projectiles shot out in a spiral from the hull and turret as the panzers ran through the tornadoes of shrapnel. A king tiger was hit by a high-explosive projectile, but it burst against the turret and did not damage the tracks. All our panzers swayed, rose and fell as we stumbled through the uneven terrain, and this wild movement made it difficult, of course, for the red gunners to aim at any specific point on our structures. We were advancing at 30 kilometers per hour, swerving and skidding almost uncontrollably, and in a few seconds the enemy PK positions rose directly in front of us. There was no time to slow down, nor any need to do so. The king tigers crashed into the positions, shattering the earth walls in a cloud of debris. I saw the entire crew of a red PK turn around and flee, but first their cannon was shattered by the tracks of the tiger, and then the men themselves were mowed down, first by the machine gun fire of the Panzer, and the survivors were trampled by the moving chains. I saw the tracks of the tiger turn red with blood, and then we ourselves collided with a PK position and caused the same destruction. The entire cannon and wheels of a PK cannon rose in front of us when we broke its emplacement, the cannon spinning in the air as it was thrown to the side by the momentum of our tonnage. The red gunners were also shattered, with boots and helmets spinning around our turret as our driver turned the machine to the side to hit another emplacement. This made us rise into the air, and I think we were airborne for a brief moment, until all our weight fell on the cannon below us. I heard and felt the red ammunition detonate under us, but by then we had already overcome the position and were heading at full speed towards the houses of the town. I could see the red troops fleeing from us down the main street, and others shooting at us with small arms or throwing grenades at us. I decided to use valuable ammunition and order my gunner to clear the settlement. 2 shots from our high-explosive rounds made the remaining Reds flee, and the shots against us ceased. We stopped with a loud crash against the earth wall of a farmer's corral, where many dead animals lay with their stiff legs up. To our right, the 2 king tigers fired intermittently toward the town, and next to me, the Capo's panther advanced along the main street, firing towards the square that could be seen in the background. I looked toward the slope behind us. Our third panther was stranded on the slope, with black smoke coming from its engine. It trembled and jerked as it tried to move forward, but it was evident that the running gear was jammed. Behind him, a mass of German infantry was already crowding, not in disciplined rows, but in a multitude of field gray, blue, and camouflage uniforms, each running on their own downhill towards us through the smoke of the bombardment that still swirled in the air. The sun rose behind them, in the east, illuminating the smoking trees of the pine forest with a gloomy glow, revealing the folds of the terrain and the rubble through which the men hurried. This frenzied horde managed to advance about 100 meters before the Katyusha rockets fell on them again. In the time it took us to descend the hill, the Soviet gunners had clearly recalibrated their launchers towards the slope, and now the high-explosive and incendiary warheads were whistling again, directly towards the mass of infantry that was charging. The stranded panther was the first to be hit, even as the horde of infantry surrounded it. With a colossal impact, the panzer turret was completely shot off the hull, throwing the panzer crew against the mass of infantry that was charging, where they disappeared under hundreds of boots. A second projectile exploded among the running figures, and then another, until I looked away from the butchery and the fragmented bodies that were spinning. In front of us, through the dusty glass of the periscope, I could make out the pasture that stretched before the town, the destroyed houses, and the rear plate of the Capo's Panther, which was turning its turret left and right in the middle of the main street, looking for resistance. I saw a group of red soldiers sneak out through a door to his right, grabbing small packages that could only be anti-tank mines. My gunner also saw them and fired a burst of machine gun fire from the coaxial cannon. The Reds scattered across the cobblestones, their bodies rolling as the bullets propelled them across the stones. To my left, the two huge king tigers roared closer to the limits of the town, silhouetted against the picturesque wooden buildings. They advanced slowly along the edge of the settlement, using an unpaved road that ran next to the town through its meadows. Even as my Panther began to enter the town, the German infantry was hot on our heels. Hundreds of our ragged and emaciated comrades began to descend the slopes and run, walk or limp behind the king tigers, while some of the better armed and seemingly more alert cautiously approached from behind towards the center of the town, deploying along the facades and sweeping the gardens in search of hidden enemy troops. In the main square, while the Capo's Panther and mine stopped with their eyes fixed on a row of Russian trucks that could serve as fuel for us, a handful of Red prisoners were dragged together, men who had hidden in basements or gardens, unarmed and reluctant to fight. We put them to work immediately, once we made sure that the trucks used gasoline and not diesel. The prisoners were put to work, using our manual pumps to extract the precious fuel from their trucks and transfer it to the two remaining Panthers. Several projectiles fell between the houses, blowing off the roofs and collapsing the walls of the gables. But the bombardment seemed to be decreasing in intensity, perhaps because the Russian artillery did not realize that their men no longer controlled the town. In this relative truce, many German civilians came out and began to gather around the Panthers, begging us to take them with us, away from the Reds that surrounded them. Our way forward is through the Spree forest to the west, the Capo told them. It's a dangerous journey and we can't be delayed by you. Come in here and see something, an old man told us. Come. While the Red prisoners continued pumping fuel, the old man took the Capo and me to the largest building in the square, an old council hall topped by an ornate weather vane. It took my eyes a while to adjust to the dim light inside, which filtered through the stained glass windows. In this old council hall, on the wooden floor polished by the feet of generations of villagers, there was a row of young women, naked on the floor. Their bodies shone with a waxy color in the dim light, between the wounds and splashes of blood that covered their bodies. From a beam in the ceiling hung two hanged men, with broken necks and open eyes looking down towards the corpses of their daughters, the man explained. They forced them to watch this, and then they hanged them back outside. The Capo allowed the civilians to climb onto the Panzers. Then he took his Walther pistol, and when the Red soldiers finished pumping the fuel, he took them aside and shot them in the back of the neck, one after another, against the wall of the council hall. A circle of villagers, soldiers, and us, the Panzer crewmen, watched the scene and then left the settlement towards the forest beyond, where we could see the king tigers stopped under the first trees of the Spree forest, our objective. A crowd of several hundred civilians followed our Panthers on foot towards the forest. We passed the king tigers, and now we were the ones in the lead. The civilians turned out to be very useful. A woman climbed onto my turret with a carbine on her shoulder and pointed out the widest tracks to me so that we could get more quickly to the dense central part of the forest. As we moved away from the village, I heard the roar of airplane engines. 3 Red planes, of the type known as Sturmovik, flew over the village, strafing it with their cannons. I saw how the red tile roofs of the houses fractured into sparks, until as we rounded a corner of the road and finally moved away, the entire village was enveloped in a whirlwind of smoke and ashes. The Russians had realized that we had managed to escape. But what had happened to Markov was already behind us, and we had to forget it. We were where we wanted to be, in the Spree forest, and now we had to cross it and escape to the west. Well, we are in the Kessel, The capo told me by radio from his panther. Now we are panzers of the Kessel, a cauldron, a boiling pot. A Kessel is a group of troops that are surrounded, but do not surrender or give up. A Kessel is a living, throbbing stew of troops and civilians, panzers, vehicles, horses, and carts. Now we were within the Kessel.